Kia ora koutou katoa, he mihi mahana ki a koutou, a kua tai mai nei ki tēnei hui a rorohiko, ko te mea tuatahi, ko te karakia tīmatatanga, nō reira whiti ora ki te whae ao, ki te ao marama, whiti ki runga, whiti ki raro, e ngū ki te kōhatu, e ngū ki te rākau, e tītaha ki tēnei taha, tītaha ki tērā taha tūturu whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e hui e, Taiki. Good morning, everybody. Or actually, good day, everybody. Morning and evening and various times that people are on and joining us for this meeting. So it's a warm welcome to everyone who's joined us to hear about the. This is our second webinar from IPBES around IPBES themes and reports that are coming out. So welcome to everyone who's joined us to talk about, to hear about a report that's out on the sustainable use of wild species. From a Aotearoa New Zealand point of view, this is a very topical issue, and we're really looking forward to hearing it. Before I hand over to Aroha to facilitate, I just wanted to acknowledge firstly the Biological Heritage National Science Challenge here in New Zealand. So I'm the co-director of that challenge. Acknowledge the challenge and our two co-organisations that have helped to bring this together, Te Tira Whakamātaki, so the National Māori Biosecurity, National Māori Biosecurity Centre, and also to Bioprotection Aotearoa. We've got Amanda back there who's going to be talking later on. So a warm welcome, very much looking forward to hearing about this report from IPBES. So I'll hand over to you, Aroha. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Sean, for starting us off in an appropriate way. Kia ora koutou. He uri au no Ngāti Awa, Ngāti Porou, tūhaurangi, ko Aroha te Pareake Mead ahau. I'm your facilitator for this morning or for this evening for one of our presenters. And as Sean has said, this is the second webinar that we've put together to profile and share the results of two really important assessment reports that have come out of IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The first webinar was on the values assessment, and one of the key messages of that assessment was that despite the diversity of nature's values, most policy-making approaches prioritise only a very narrow set of values, and that has been at the expense of both nature and society. And the assessment report showed at least 50 different approaches for valuing nature and offered ways in which we could operationalize bringing a greater set of values into our policy and decision-making roles. But today's assessment is on a really important issue. In fact, it's this issue that got me involved in conservation in general, because it always amazed at how many conflicts exist around the world between Indigenous peoples and conservationists. And often at the root of these conflicts was the issue of sustainable use. And over the years, there have been some really heated exchanges. But this assessment report for me represents a kind of departure from having one view or another, because it is a global assessment based on multiple inputs of peer-reviewed papers and other resources, and hopefully shows us ways in which we can reconcile our love of nature and our wish to conserve and protect nature with also being able to sustainably use many of the wild species in nature. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Marla Emery. And Marla was the co-chair of the whole assessment of wild species. She is a Adjunct Professor at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont, and also a scientific advisor for the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research. So Marla, if I could please pass over to you. Thank you.
Marla, I think you might.
Marla, you're muted.
Indeed I am. Thank you. Let me start again. Thank you so much, Aroha, for making me welcome here. And I think that I might need that pop-up to show my screen again, if it could be. I'm not seeing my screen.
We can see the presentation.
I'm going to stop sharing and let you send that to me again. And in the meantime, I'm just going to say thank you, Aroha, so much for that welcome, and to the organizations that are sponsoring this important webinar. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. There we go. Yeah, sorry, I was at the PowerPoint. There we go. Great. Thank you. So as Aroha mentioned, I had the honor to co-chair the IPBES assessment on sustainable use of wild species with my colleagues Jean-Marc Fromentin and John Donaldson. And what I'd like to talk with you about today are both the key findings and how we arrived at them for the assessment as a whole, but in particular, our findings with regards to Indigenous peoples, sustainable use, and conservation. So let me begin by just telling you a little bit about how the sustainable use assessment was conducted and why it was conducted. So we were provided with a scoping report that laid out a number of objectives for the assessment. First, to analyze the status and trends in sustainable use of wild species and the drivers and causes of changes in the sustainability of wild species uses. To also consider approaches to enhance the sustainable use of wild species while identifying challenges and opportunities to doing so. And then finally, to strengthen practices, measures, capacities, and tools for engaging in sustainable use of wild species. And notably, we were directed to assume that or to recognize an inseparable unity between nature and humanity. We approached this task by understanding that sustainable use of wild species, or indeed all uses of wild species, whether or not they are sustainable, are in fact social ecological systems. And those systems are made up of the species that are in use. And we identified and particularly looked at 4 taxonomic groups, if you will, or groups of species: aquatic animals, plants, algae, and fungi; trees, recognizing that they're plants, but feeling that it was useful to treat them separately from other plants; and terrestrial animals. Human beings use them through a series of practices, or acquire those wild species through a series of practices, both extractive and non-extractive. So fishing, gathering, logging, terrestrial animal harvesting, which includes both lethal hunting and non-lethal activities that involve extracting a species from its environment, such as, for example, collecting fish for the aquarium trade. And non-extractive practices such as ecotourism. And human beings notably make use of wild species in a great variety of ways. And these include, but are not limited to, ceremonial or ritual purposes, decorative or aesthetic uses, for energy, as food and feed, as sources of education, learning, and intellectual enrichment, as materials for construction and for making of things, as important foundations for medicine and hygiene, as means of recreation. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There are many others. So the report notably consists of a summary for policymakers, which is now available and translated into the 6 official United Nations languages. That summary for policymakers is backed up by a full assessment that consists of 6 chapters, a total of more than 1,000 pages. We have dozens of case studies from all over the world, and it took us 4 years to prepare that, this assessment from 2018 to 2022. The assessment draws on a variety of knowledge sources, including a rigorous review of the peer-reviewed literature and the gray literature, a very important process for engaging with Indigenous and local knowledge that includes workshops, as well as a call for contributions from Indigenous peoples and local communities around the world. And ultimately, we reviewed and incorporated information from over 6,000 references. You see here a picture of the really wonderful team that we had the honor of working with for 4 years, consisting of 85 experts who made direct individual contributions to the full assessment. We had more than 200 additional contributing authors, and our experts came from more than 50 countries around the world. And this was a very multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary group of experts, which includes both natural and social scientists. So let me just share with you then a few key findings. First, at least 50,000 wild species are used globally to meet the needs of billions of people all around the world. And we find options to ensure their sustainable use. 1 in 5 people rely on wild species for income and for food. And looking a little more deeply at food, over 10,000 wild species are harvested for human food. And over 2.4 billion people, that is 1 in 3 people globally, depend on fuel wood for cooking. We find as well that sustainable use of wild species is critical to reverse the biodiversity decline. And I'd like to share with you in that regard 4 what we can call data points to consider. First, the IPBES Global Assessment in 2019 identified that overexploitation is a leading contributor to biodiversity decline. It is, in fact, a main threat to marine ecosystems, the #1 threat to marine ecosystems, and the #2 threat to terrestrial and freshwater ecosystems. At the same time, IUCN assessed the status of 10,098 species from 10 taxonomic groups. These were species that were raising some level of concern, and found that over 34% of them are used sustainably. We note also that Indigenous peoples manage over 38 million square kilometers of land globally across 87 countries. And this constitutes approximately 40% of conserved areas, and in particular areas with very high biodiversity and long histories of sustainable use. So there are then, we find, examples of uses of wild species that have been sustainable for millennia. And I'd like to share with you an example from my own work, something that I've been familiar with for approximately 30 years. That is the use of wild rice. The Latin binomial for wild rice is Zizania palustris, and one of the indigenous names for it is manuman. Wild rice is an aquatic grain or grass that grows in the Great Lakes region of North America in both the United States and Canada. It is a staple food for the indigenous peoples of the region, and it relies on very particular hydrological conditions, but also has a very strong and ancient relationship with the indigenous peoples of this region. A large number of the tribes that are currently in this location had previously been in the east of North America, and they received a prophecy that they should move west. And they should move west until they arrived at the place where food grows on water. When they found these lakes and riverbeds with an abundance of wild rice, they understood that their prophecy had come true, and this was a place for them to settle down. And so wild rice is not only a staple food, but is also central to their creation story. It is an essential food for ceremonies and rituals. And indeed, there is a tribe, the Menominee, who predate the Ojibwa arriving from the east in this region, whose name is essentially the name of wild rice. Thus, we consider wild rice to be a cultural keystone species. And I will refer back to wild rice on a couple additional occasions here during this talk, but I'd like to invite you to think about the cultural keystone species in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and think about similar connections there. So there are also examples of local and regional uses of wild species that have become unsustainable and then been restored to sustainability. I know that Dr. Dilys Roe is going to be speaking after me, and she will give you some more details about that, so I will not linger here. But as you see in this photograph, this fish, pirarucu, which is an Amazonian fish, is very, very large. Likewise, there are examples of large-scale commercial global trade uses that have been restored to sustainability after a period of great unsustainability. And let me provide you with just a little more here. This is the case of the Atlantic bluefin tuna. In the 1980s, with the rise of a global market for sushi, there was a great expansion of the Atlantic bluefin tuna fleet, heavy fishing, very little regulation, a great deal of illegal fishing for it, and a collapse in the stocks. High levels of concern about that, some efforts on the part of nations to develop a solution for it that wasn't terribly successful until more collaborative and participatory negotiations began. And as of the present time, those negotiations which have resulted in the establishment of catch limits, of limits or prescriptions for the kinds of technologies that can and cannot be used, and seasonal limits has ultimately brought us back to the place where today the Atlantic bluefin tuna is used at biologically sustainable levels. So how do we get there then? If we see that there are both obviously a plethora of examples around the world of uses that are not sustainable, but as I have just said, many examples around the world that are sustainable across a variety of scales, a variety of taxa, a variety of habitats. What are the common characteristics then of what makes for sustainable uses and also what tends to lead toward unsustainable uses? And this is one of the key findings of this sustainable use assessment. So there are a number of constraining conditions in policy and management that we consistently find. with unsustainable uses of wild species. Those are policies and management approaches that ignore history, that ignore the rights of Indigenous and local peoples, that overlook the social context within which a use occurs. Frequently, mismatches between the scale of the use and the scale of the management that is applied to it, and in particular, large-scale approaches implemented without customization at local levels, approaches that criminalize the actions and practices of marginalized people, that create or exacerbate existing power imbalances, and an over-reliance on formal laws and rules. There are, however, a number of enabling conditions in policy and management that we see consistently across uses that are sustainable. And those are policy and management approaches that are adaptive and participatory and democratic, that ensure robust institutions, but here we find that those are both formal institutions and customary institutions. Approaches that are tailored to the specific context, so there may be a large approach that works at a sort of general scale, but that needs to be tailored to the specific location and social context within that is going to be governed. Policy and management approaches that are inclusive and participatory, and that recognize plural knowledge and values. And here we can make the connection with your previous webinar on the values assessment. And importantly, where benefits and I would say also the costs of conservation are equitably shared. So we find then, as we look at those constraining conditions and enabling conditions, that when our goal is the sustainable use of wild species, we ignore the social or the ecological at peril to ecologically sustainable, at peril of creating ecologically unsustainable conditions and socially unjust outcomes. So now I'd like to take a little bit of a deeper dive into an important aspect of both the ecological sustainability and the social equity of policy and management for sustainable use of wild species. And that is the significance, the implications for Indigenous peoples. Sustainable use of wild species is central to the identity and the very existence of many Indigenous peoples. Sustainable use of wild species contributes to both physical and emotional well-being for Indigenous peoples and is an important aspect of cultural expressions. And I refer here back to, for example, the important role of wild rice in ceremonies of all sorts for people, Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes region of North America. And so, loss of opportunity to engage in sustainable use of wild species is literally an existential threat for many Indigenous peoples. Sustainable use of wild species is also a critical source of culturally appropriate livelihoods. And here, livelihoods we understand as anything that provides the material and the means for the material and cultural survival of a people's. So this includes both subsistence uses of wild species and trade, both informal trade and formal trade in wild species. Let me just talk a little bit more then about subsistence uses of wild species. So there is the individual who goes out and harvests the wild species, but the contributions of wild species to livelihoods are broader than that individual at that moment harvesting. They include preparation to go out and harvest, which is everything from getting tools ready and knowing how to make tools and when to go and where to go, and the ceremonies that might be said in order to ensure an appropriate and a proper harvest, as well as the distribution after harvest to members of the larger community, so that it is more than simply the individual who's doing the harvest who is supported and sustained by that. It is both an entire culture and all the individuals who will benefit from the plants, animals, fungi, fish that may be obtained. Likewise, just to remind ourselves that trade has been going on by Indigenous peoples for millennia. It is not something that's cropped up in the industrial world. Sustainable use of wild species is grounded by Indigenous peoples, is grounded in Indigenous knowledge, practices, and worldviews. And the wheel that you see in front of you, the circle that you see in front of you here, comes out of the generous sharing of knowledge and worldviews of dozens to hundreds of Indigenous peoples and local communities who contributed to the sustainable use assessment. And what we heard loud and clear are that central to the sustainable use of wild species by Indigenous communities are abundant and healthy populations of wild species, and also approaching their use as well as their non-use, their harvest, with respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, viewing the non-human world, the animals, the fish, the plants, the fungi, as family, not figuratively, but literally as family, that must be treated with the same sort of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility that human family members are. The capacity to do this is embedded in knowledge, in community, identity, and spirituality. It brings about benefits including well-being and health, and it is food and traditional medicines. It is supported by language, which encodes much of the knowledge, and ritual and ceremony, and community institutions and governance. So we find that a number of drivers that constrain sustainable use of wild species in general are particularly challenging for Indigenous peoples and their ability to engage in sustainable use of wild species. And these include land use and sea use change, climate change, pollution, and invasive alien species. Notably, illegal harvest and trade, and something that I think all of us were quite surprised to find as we worked on this assessment is that illegal trade in wild species is currently the third largest illegal trade globally, following, very sadly, trafficking of human beings and drugs. Another key constraint on Indigenous peoples' capacities, abilities to engage in sustainable use of wild species is the incomplete implementation at national levels of international instruments regarding the rights of access to traditional territories and to engage in customary sustainable resource use. In addition, at national levels and global levels, sectoral policies, particularly forestry, agriculture, energy, infrastructure, and extractive industries, as well as conservation itself, compromise access to lands and resources. In addition, as I noted previously, much knowledge about how to sustainably use wild species is encoded in language, and the loss of language results in the loss of much of that knowledge, as can educational programming that is either devoid of or in some cases disparaging of local cultural and environmental conditions. Similarly, lack of attention to gendered roles where knowledge and practices of wild species uses may be quite gendered, as well as loss of opportunity to act outside of market economies. That is in particular to the loss of opportunities to engage in subsistence uses of wild species. At the same time, there are clear drivers that enable Indigenous peoples' sustainable uses of wild species, and at the same time that strengthen sustainable use of wild species writ large. These include strengthening customary institutions and rules, and it's noteworthy that when customary institutions and rules are strong, one of the benefits is lower transaction costs for monitoring and enforcing conservation practices and stewardship. Likewise, when Indigenous knowledge is valued, and it is essential here to observe the principle of free, prior, and informed consent at all times in this regard. Important knowledge is brought to bear on sustainable use of wild species. This is knowledge that is often lacking in science. If you think about it, over 50,000 species of plants, animals, and fungi and algae being used. There is not all of those species are well understood by science, and but they are likely, many of them will be understood by the Indigenous peoples with long histories of using them. So here is a source of knowledge that is often lacking in science and frequently complementary to science where the science does exist. In addition, Indigenous peoples with long histories of using wild species very frequently have systems for monitoring, stewardship, and adaptation to changes that have stood the test of time, that have weathered many changes, and offer important models going forward. They likewise frequently include and emphasize systems for equitable distribution of the costs and benefits of uses of wild species, which incentivizes more sustainable use of wild species. So again, I want to return to the case of wild rice and talk about how a conflict around uses of a wild species has ultimately become a partnership for sustainable use of wild rice. I was a research scientist with the United States Forest Service for 31 years. And as I said, I worked a great deal with the tribes in the Great Lakes. When I first began to work for the US Forest Service, the US federal government was largely not honoring the commitments of the federal government through treaties with its tribes. It lost a very important lawsuit in the Great Lakes and was required to honor the treaty requirements surrounding access for fishing, hunting, and gathering, among other things, gathering wild rice. This led to the Forest Service and the tribes in the region sitting down together to negotiate how these treaty rights would be respected. And wild rice was right at the top of the list of species to begin with. An approach for monitoring the health of wild rice was negotiated, and initially this was a very challenging process. But over the course of 2 decades, Those challenges were hashed out at a negotiating table, and now there is a very important partnership between this federal land management agency and the tribes in the region. They regard each other as partners in the stewardship of wild rice, with the tribes managing and regulating the harvest of wild rice by their own members, the Forest Service regulating use by non-tribal members, and sharing of information with a sense that the future of wild rice, which will be affected by climate change, which is affected by mining and development in the region, is in the hands of both the tribes and the federal land management agencies, that conservation absolutely requires both of those parties. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you some of the key results of the IPBES assessment on sustainable use of wild species. It's been a real pleasure.
Kia ora. Thank you very much, Marla, for providing that overview of the findings of the IPBES assessment report on sustainable use of wild species. Just to remind all of us here that though the messages might be quite familiar to us, and some of the processes used as well, court cases, and challenges to government in order to have rights recognised, that this report has come out of an intergovernmental process. So 140 member states have received the report, read it, edited it, provided comments on it, and ultimately approved it. So it is really quite groundbreaking to have that level of acknowledgement of the issues within this report. I'd just like to encourage you all to, if you have any questions, just to jot them down in the question bar on your screen, and we'll get to those eventually. But I'd now like to hand over to Dilys Roe, who is chair of the IUCN Specialist Group on Sustainable Use and Livelihoods, just to talk through some of the implications of this report for conservation policy and practice. Thank you, Dilys.
Thanks very much. I just check you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see the screen. Okay,
great. Thanks, and thanks very much for inviting me to participate in this webinar. So yes, I was part of the IPBES assessment in a very small way as a review editor of one of the chapters and as a minor contributing author to one of the other chapters. But it was only really, right at the end when the whole report came together, that even as somebody that had been involved in the process, that I was able to sort of sit back and reflect on the overall messages from it. And for me, there were a number of sort of key takeaways. And I guess the first one of these is just the fact that sustainable use is such a common or normal practice. It's quite often framed as a sort of slightly niche, possibly a slightly unsavory practice. But about half the world's population uses wild species in some form or other, with over 50,000 species in use, as Marla pointed out. Another key takeaway, that it is central to the well-being of large numbers of people, particularly in low-income countries. It's not a niche activity only practiced by a few people. And it's especially central and critical to the identity and existence of many Indigenous and local communities. I think it's really, really important to note that over-exploitation, so unsustainable use, is a key threat to biodiversity and a key driver of biodiversity loss. But that doesn't mean we should write off use, because well-managed sustainable use, by complete contrast, is a critical tool, both for conservation and for local people's livelihoods. And just going back to the statistic that Marla highlighted about the number of species that are in use and used sustainably, What's key to me about that, not so much that 1/3 of those 10,000 species have been documented as being used sustainably, because initially that doesn't sound so great, because that potentially means 2/3 are not sustainable. But actually digging into that research paper, the finding is of those 10,000 species, only 1/6 have been documented as being used unsustainably, and 1/3, so double the number, have been documented as being used sustainably. And then there's insufficient information about the rest of those species. Another key point for me is that not all use is equal, so not all species can be used as sustainably as others. Some species are much more resilient to use than others, and these are particularly those that reproduce quickly, grow quickly, have wide ranges. Terrestrial species are much more at higher levels of extinction risk than aquatic species, and slow-growing species also much more at high danger of extinction risk. And then the fact that use is much more likely to be sustainable when there are clear land tenure and resource rights is really, really striking, and that there should be equitable distribution of costs and benefits of species use. And as Marla says, this really needs to explicitly account for gender, because women often bear more of the costs of wildlife management and use while gaining fewer of the benefits. And then my final takeaway for me was that sustainable use involves a huge wide range of practices. They can be extractive or non-extractive, they can be lethal or non-lethal, they can be customary or commercial. So what does this actually mean for conservation policy? Well, I hope that it means that sustainable use will actually become much more mainstream in conservation policy. And it really should be. 30 years before we've published this report on sustainable use, countries agreed the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. And within that, and I think often overlooked, is the fact that sustainable use is one of the 3 foundational pillars of that convention, along with conservation and equitable benefit sharing. So it's been there for 30 years, but it's been one of those things that's been slightly marginalized. It's also really, really prevalent in other biodiversity conventions. So CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Fauna and Flora, recognizes that sustainable use, whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive, provides an economically competitive land use option, which means that people will keep that land under wildlife, which they can use, rather than converting it to other uses. CMS, the Convention on Migratory Species, also says something similar. It notes that sustainable use can provide incentives for conservation and restoration. And this is because of the benefits that people get from that use, and then subsequently invest in conservation. Currently, we're negotiating a new strategic plan for the Convention on Biological Diversity, a new post-2020 global biodiversity framework to guide conservation action to 2050. The framework has a number of goals. Goal A of the framework is concerned with conserving biodiversity. And included in that is a key target about sustainable use, which emphasises that all use should be sustainable, legal and safe. So that goal recognises that unsustainable use is a key threat to biodiversity conservation. Goal B of the new framework is concerned with nature's contributions to people. And nature being able to contribute to people depends on nature being conserved. So it depends on the success of Goal A. And again, within that goal, there is a target 9, which is also about ensuring that use of wild species is sustainable, legal and safe. But in this case, in this particular part of the framework, that is specifically in order to ensure that nature can continue to provide benefits to people, especially those that are most dependent on biodiversity. So this new framework that's under negotiation recognises the importance of sustainable use. It recognises the importance of ensuring use is sustainable, but also ensuring that use continues so that it can deliver benefits to people. And in both of those targets and throughout the framework, it recognises the need to protect the livelihoods of and the customary use by Indigenous people and local communities particularly. And that, protecting customary sustainable use, is also a specific article within the Convention. Overall, IPLC rights around access, participation, empowerment and so on are all addressed in the Global Biodiversity Framework, both across it and then also in a specific target, Target 21. So hopefully this new framework will be agreed in Montreal in December when parties get together for COP15. And if it's agreed, and we are assuming it will be, then parties will need to develop new biodiversity strategies that deliver on these targets at national and subnational levels. So in New Zealand, in my country in the UK, in Marla's country in the USA, we'll have to be thinking about how we respond to these different targets and to this new framework and make it relevant to our countries, which does mean also mainstreaming sustainable use at national levels. What does this mean then for conservation practice beyond conservation policy? Well, again, I think all too often the focus of conservation practice has been on that conservation pillar of the Convention on Biodiversity and other biodiversity agreements, rather than on sustainable use or benefit sharing. And conservation itself is quite narrowly often interpreted as protection, more so than just conservation. So just as sustainable use is becoming mainstream in the new Global Biodiversity Framework, it will need to be more mainstream than it currently is in conservation practice. There's lots of evidence that it works as long as the conditions are right, and those conditions include clear land and resource rights, good governance, a good understanding of species and ecosystem biology, and acceptance that use is conservation. It's not contrary to conservation, or it certainly can be conservation if it's done right. So just to highlight a couple of case studies, Marla showed this photograph of this incredible fish, the piraruku. It's the world's largest freshwater fish that exists in the Amazon. It weighs up to 200 kgs. And in the 1990s, it was on the brink of extinction due to overfishing and illegal trade. In the 2000s, community management of the fisheries was introduced. So fishing was banned in some locations, but agreed in places where it could be managed by communities and where monitoring was properly introduced and fishing quotas introduced. It's very important for meat, both for sale and for local food security. And from 2010, the skin has also been used as a luxury, sustainable fashion leather. It's used to make boots and wallets and all sorts, and is hugely, hugely valuable. So since 2000, piraruku population has increased by over 400% directly as a result of community-based management and communities being able to use and benefit from the piraruku trade. Here's another one, vicuña, a really well-known sustainable use case study. Again, in the 1960s, huge amount of illegal trade. Vicuña were hunted for their wool and numbers were depleted to the extent that only 6,000 remained in the wild. Today, there are over 350,000. And this is because of community-based programs that have been introduced that allow the live shearing of vicuña. So communities capture them, they shepherd them into corrals, they shear them and then they release them. And the fibre is hugely valuable, again, for the luxury fashion trade. Most of it gets exported to Italy, where it's made into really luxurious shawls. And finally, another one. These are ibex and markhor. These are both forms of wild goat that occur in Central Asia. And again, numbers were really, really low at the beginning of the 2000s, and a community-based trophy hunting program was put into place where trophy hunting happened on communal land in community conservancies. It generated significant benefits for local people's livelihoods in the form of the income that the hunting generated, but also the jobs and then associated tourism opportunities. And again, just looking at this graph, you can see the impact that it had on the population of these goat species, these wild goat species, across their ranges. Just the graph shows a distinctly upward trajectory. And not just on the goat species themselves, but because these goats had value and were being conserved because they then had value as trophy hunting specimens, they're also prey for snow leopards. So it also brought about an increase in the number of snow leopards and the conservation of over 400,000 hectares of land. So those are just a few examples of how sustainable use has had a demonstrable impact both on local people's livelihoods and on the conservation fortune of critically, in many cases, critically endangered species. And there are many, many examples like this that are published on the CITES website and other places. So again, thinking about the implications of conservation practice, yes, this evidence exists that sustainable use works if the conditions are right. But in many cases, the trouble is that these conditions don't exist. These conditions, particularly around land and resource rights, where there's often a lack of political will to devolve rights to local people or to protect existing rights. A study that was conducted some years ago by the Forest Peoples Programme, an NGO based in the UK that particularly campaigns for Indigenous people's rights, that looked at customary sustainable use, really highlighted as the key challenges a lack of secure land and resource rights, a lack of recognition of customary laws and institutions, a lack of recognition of the role of sustainable use in biodiversity protection, and imposed protected areas and other conservation practices over and above sustainable use and customary practices. So just thinking about beyond sustainable use, this recognition that local communities and particularly Indigenous communities play a key role in biodiversity conservation has been recognised for many years, but really came to global prominence following another IPBES report, the IPBES Global Assessment that was published in 2019. And this highlighted that Indigenous people and local communities are the most effective stewards of biodiversity. It highlighted that biodiversity is declining across the globe, but it's declining less rapidly on land that is owned or managed by Indigenous people. But the ability of Indigenous people and local communities to manage biodiversity is limited because of their weak rights. So this importance of IPLC rights is now increasingly prominent in the CBD negotiations, but also elsewhere outside of the conservation sector. So for example, there's recently been international endorsement in the climate change sector of the principles for locally led adaptation to climate change, recognising that local people are best placed to understand how best to adapt to climate change and need to be supported to do so. So this momentum in the climate change sector is really now gaining momentum again in the conservation sector, and increasing calls for locally led conservation, locally led action to protect biodiversity. And locally led conservation includes sustainable use. So I think in summary, the sustainable use assessment has come at an absolutely vital time. It re-emphasises calls that are gaining prominence in other places within the conservation sector and outside it for far greater attention to locally led action, and specifically to Indigenous peoples and local communities' rights to manage, use and protect their biodiversity if we really want to secure it in the long term. Thanks very much, and my email address is there if anybody wants to follow up with me, and also the website of the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Specialist Group, which is the group that I chair. Thanks very much.
Kia ora, Dilys. Thank you very much for that really important presentation, which gives us a much larger overview of other relevant international treaties and agreements. And I think you raised some points that would be quite controversial in many sectors, including that we need to mainstream sustainable use, but also reminding us that sustainable use actually is conservation. And it's one of the 3 pillars of the Convention on Biological Diversity. What we're going to do now is just have 2 discussants from here in Aotearoa, just to give some feedback on what they took from the presentations and the report itself. Just a reminder to everyone, you are welcome to leave questions in the question bar. So please, this is a rare opportunity for you to speak to or to ask of Dr. Marla Emery, one of the co-chairs of the entire assessment, and Dr. Dilys Roe. So please ask questions. But I'm now going to hand over to Amanda Black, who is Dr. Amanda Black, who is the Director of Bioprotection Aotearoa. Amanda.
Kia ora, Aroha. Ko Amanda Black tuku ingoa, he huri hau tuahoi me whakatoa te iwi. Kia ora koutou to our fellow panellists on the screen, and thank you very much for your presentations. A lot of work went into them, it's very insightful, and I've been writing down notes, scribbling as we've discussed. So I think coming from my experience working in research with Indigenous communities, helping them to manage some of their conservation, particularly I work in keeping forests healthy. A lot of it has to do with biosecurity as well as the umbrella insidious effects of climate change too. So I guess not really sustainable harvesting, but certainly sustainable management of these resources. And I noticed in the presentations, there were a lot of figures bandying around, and there's always a lot of figures in these types of discussions. You know, this percentage species, we're looking at this decline. So it's really, really hard for someone to get their head around which figures they should be looking at. I acknowledge a lot of work has gone into these types of reports. I do find them very generic. So I wonder when it comes to Aotearoa how nimble they can be to adapt to certain conditions that we have. So coming back to, I guess, you know, thinking about the examples which I work with, there's nothing that I would really strongly disagree with any sort of the evidence or discussion that's happened. I think a couple of points that Dilys rose about political will and certain and having particular conditions that would help sustainable management. Yes, that's where I come from. I see a lot of these policy documents. I do work on a panel that's helping incorporate some Indigenous knowledge into policy around climate change with one of the ministries, and I have worked helping inform policy in biosecurity as well. And my biggest issue is that these documents all get developed and then they sit on a shelf and gather dust. And then there's a whole lot of, you know, political change that happens. And so we can all, I think, in theory, agree this is a great way of doing it, and particularly managing at the local level, I think is incredibly sustainable. And it's the local people, communities are the best people to manage their resources. However, and particularly in conservation, because you rely so heavily on communities to do this, because there is no money. It's not like the primary sector, which I also work in. You know, if there's an issue, they throw millions and millions of dollars at it and you can come up with a solution. It's just a little different. The political will to implement any suggestions in these policies that will trickle down to the communities is extremely difficult. It's so rare, and you would have to change that in the ministry level so that they would give that power over to the communities actually managing, which means handing over money. And that I've never really seen before is a ministry to hand over money to a community who would be incredibly effective at managing their resources. They just don't do it. And I think that's our biggest block here in Aotearoa is ministries, instead of hiring more people to liaise with communities and to reinvent wheels and everything else that we've seen and done before, instead of handing out the power over to the communities that can make that, you know, change and that management that we need, they instead add more layers and put on more burdens to these communities, so it actually ends up getting worse. So that's the thing, we can do all the science, we can write all the policies, but it's having the ministries actually give up some of that control so that we can, you know, reap the benefits. I mean, for me, as an Indigenous person and as a scientist, that's our biggest block, I think, to achieving this.
Amanda, well, thank you for that. Yes, that's certainly been my experience as well. Not only the lack of political will, but when it's the crunch time of actually handing resources back to communities to go and manage by themselves. There's certainly a huge reluctance. I'm just going to now ask Juani Langsbury to give some comments as well. Juani's from Kaitahu. He's the ecotourism manager, which includes managing the Royal Albatross Centre. So Juani, can I just ask you for your feedback and some comments on this important report?
O, kia koutou, nā mihi ki koutou, tēnā koe Aroha. I guess firstly, tēnā koe Marla, very interested in the sustainable use of wild species. And probably at the beginning, that term inseparable unity of nature and humanity sat really well with myself. Made me think about the tikanga that came to mind when considering the corridor around wild rice and the Pareake in the same way that we think of our own mahinga kai. There was a section where those enabling conditions that you touched on are very similar to those that are required by Māori and Aotearoa to enable us to achieve the outcomes for whānau and hapu when it comes to sustaining ourselves through thinking about that concept of healthy land and healthy people and enabling those things to happen at place. And it aligned with our assertion that there's a commercial component to customer use and a recognition that we've already gained, but not to the extent that I think most whānau have aspirations. And then just touching on yours as well, Dilys, tēnā koe. The topics were really important to iwi katoa, I believe. We look forward to the sustainable customer use being enabled by policy for terrestrial species in New Zealand in the same way that it happens for our marine species under our kaitiaki or tangatiaki models and concepts. We recognise the values of CITES and are interested in the intent of the global biodiversity framework, but sometimes those things, when you look at them from our perspective, actually put barriers in place to our own practice. So sometimes they've been addressed under treaty settlements where, being a kaitahu or naitahu, I'm able to hold and utilise taonga species. And for us, a taonga species is every indigenous species in Aotearoa, especially where they are on our ancestral land, which is all the land within our motu or our takiwa. And I suppose just in closing, thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today, the both of you. It's what motivates us to continue with our mahi. And it enables us that have the opportunity to influence the Crown part of our treaty partnership, what's required for a framework to enable mana whenua to do what they did prior to the Europeans arriving in Aotearoa. So nā mihi koutou katoa, kia ora aroha.
Kia ora, Juani, thank you very much. So between the two of you, you raised some really important issues. And one that I'd really like to take up is just like where to from here. Yes, it's gone through 140 governments who've consented to it, but the reason that I wanted to organise this webinar is that because nationally we haven't heard anything about the Sustainable Use report, nor have we heard anything about the values assessment, which is why we've done these webinars. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of effort being taken to provide visibility to these reports, let alone try and implement them, the findings within government departments. So I just wanted to ask either of you if you have sort of any suggestions as to how to provide greater visibility to the findings of this report, because we can certainly see the value, but it's really getting it out to a much wider audience. So your feedback on that would be much appreciated. Marla, can I ask you first?
Yes, thanks, Aroha. This is exactly the moment in which IPBES begins to look for opportunities to do just that. So again, thank you so much for organizing this webinar, which I think is a first step, but obviously not a last step. I will say that with past assessments, IPBES assessments in the United States, for example, there were opportunities to testify to Congress that were organized. I don't know if there are similar opportunities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, to speak to ministers, to speak to your legislative body. But if there are, and you have the wherewithal to organize them, we will be there remotely. It's kind of a long ways to go to actually get to you physically, but if it can be done remotely, we will be there. So let us know, please, please engage us if there are opportunities of that sort. We are also looking for opportunities to publish key pieces of the assessment in ways that are compelling and accessible. And there again, if you see opportunities, if you see venues for publications, I would frankly like to see us do things like videos and other non-text based ways of communicating this information. Please, we would very much like to do that. I'm also frankly thinking about, we compiled dozens, possibly approaching hundreds of case studies that offer very important examples, lessons, and models. We're beginning to talk about, is there the opportunity to create a book that is as visual as it is textual? Are there opportunities for articles in magazines that reach people broadly, digital and physical magazines that reach people broadly and begin to influence the larger conversation? We know those, I know these things in my section of the world, but not in yours. So let us know.
Thanks, Marla. Well, Dilys, so you're part of the IUCN Specialist Group, Sustainable Use and Livelihoods. And within that community of IUCN, this tension of sustainable use has certainly always been present during my 20 years now involvement with IUCN. Do you see this report being able to influence our world's largest conservation organisation to have a more inclusive approach to sustainable use? Can you see it having an impact?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I really hope so. Maybe I'm being naively optimistic, but you know, IUCN, as you know, prides itself on being a science-based organisation and science-based policy or evidence-based. So I think it's hugely valuable having something like the IPBES assessment, which does bring together all of this evidence, and it gives you, as somebody that's trying to advocate for change, something to kind of say, it's not just me that's saying this, you know, this is the result. Look at this assessment. This is bringing together evidence by however many experts from however many countries and however many peer-reviewed documents. I think it's a great tool for others to be able to wield to be able to say the evidence exists. But I think, you know, whether we're trying to influence IUCN or governments or whoever, it's then, as Marla says, I think it really does, a lot of this come down to how you then communicate the evidence. The summary for policymakers itself is quite a big document, and I can't imagine very many policymakers will read it from cover to cover. And then the chapters themselves are incredibly rich, but you know, it's 1,000 pages. So I think, you know, it behoves us to kind of try and understand the political economy of how our governments work, of how IUCN or others that we want to influence work and how they make decisions, and then tailor our communications to fit with how they make decisions. But certainly in IUCN, you know, as you'll know, IUCN has its own policy on sustainable use of living resources, which it's had since 2000. And it's constantly being challenged through its membership and in other places by some organisations which just don't agree with sustainable use, or who kind of almost deliberately equate use with very specific forms of use, you know, controversial trophy hunting or reptile skin production or things that involve just lethal use. And I think that's another huge value of the IPBES assessment, is just really making this case that we can't say sustainable use is bad because half the world's population depends on it. We all use wild species in our tea, in our food, you know, whatever, without even thinking about it. And so I think it provides us with great a great source of evidence that we can use to make a stronger case to whatever constituency it is that we want to influence.
Yeah. Kia ora, Dilys, thank you for that. Well, we've reached our time. And before I hand over to Sean to close us off, I just want to thank both of you, Marla and Dilys, for giving your time so generously to us, and also to Amanda and Juani for your perspectives. And also like to thank the 3 convening organisations, which I'm all affiliated to. I got 3 milestones at once. Bioprotection, Aotearoa, Centre of Research Excellence, Biological Heritage National Science Challenge, and Te Tira Whakamātaki, the Māori Biosecurity and Environmental NGO. Well, Dilys, I can't resist saying that your country's government is just truly fascinating. I understand you have yet another new Prime Minister. I couldn't resist, I'm sorry. Even all the way over here, we sort of scratch our heads and think, what on earth is going on up there?
I think we're the laughing stock. We're close to being a failed state, I think, at the moment.
Oh, well, I wish you the very best. Sean, if I could please hand over to you just to close us off. Thank you again, everyone.
Pleasure.
Oh, kia ora. I just wanted to just jump in there and take the opportunity to thank everyone, actually, and just to say to you, Marla, and you, Dilys, that was really quite an inspirational set of presentations. Speaking from the heart, one of the ideas and the conceptualization that you gave to us with regards to wild rice, there's a concept, and Juani touched on it too, that we call that he mentioned it actually, and that's mahinga kai. And for us, the concept of mahinga kai actually revolves around the whole chain of use of wild resources. So it talks about the knowledge that goes with the use of wild resources. It talks about the tools that go with that. It talks of mahi means to work, so that's the process of harvesting wild food resources. It's about the distribution, it's about the connection, it's also about the responsibility and the intergenerational relationship that we have with our wild resources. That's kind of underpinned by a concept called whakapapa, which is the link, the familial linkages to wild resources. So I really heard that message coming through in your presentations, and for me it's just super exciting for that message to be coming across from such a high level, from such a broad spanning report that's really, you know, so many countries involved, so many people involved, so many documents of literature involved with that. You know, we're over 6,000. It's so super impressive, and I think I agree with Aroha that this report is really kind of it's a key moment in time, and the real challenge now is how do we bring that information that's clearly important globally, clearly underpinned by a really big mass of literature. How do we bring that information to bear to make change, especially from the point of view of Indigenous people? So I just wanted to take that opportunity to say that and to thank you all for a really good session. So kia ora koutou. So I'll just close us off now, and part of this karakia, this prayer to close, is really about acknowledging, the Sky Father and the Earth Mother above us and below us, and reconnecting ourselves back to nature. That's so vitally important. So kia ora koutou. Whakamau te kōrero, whakamau te wānanga, whakamau ki a rangi nui e tu iho nei, whakamau hoki ki a papa tuanuku e tākota wake nei, whakatīna ki te tumo te maramatanga, nō reira tūturu whakamaua ki a tīna.
Tīna.
Haumi e hui e tāiki e. Kia ora koutou.
Kia ora, Sean. Thank you very much, and thanks to all our attendees. Kia ora.
Thanks all.